So what are we doing today other than putting a tire on a cedar that belonged there that I took off for another job? I wanted to start talking about the comparison of the 565 and 572s. I got a couple of these 572s laying around. This one here is mine with a heated handle for working in the wintertime. And you all know this one is my junk pile build that actually turned out to be a pretty good solid saw. It's the main work saw I have right now. And this is my trusty 565, and the bar for the 565 and also the 572 sits on my project 575. That's a lot of fives to keep track of, isn't it? So what I'm going to do, because people like cookie cuts, I'm going to start with a couple cookie cuts with each of these saws, and then I'm going to discuss what I think about them and whether it shows in the cookie cuts or not. I have a fairly strong opinion about what I like about each saw, and I think we're just going to do this one, and this one, and leave it at that, and then I'll talk about the other ones. So we're back to our little saw course, and I'm not sure if I'm going to go the whole round with it. I think I'm just going to focus on that one and that one over there, just those two. So let me get things started first. Now I got a fairly unique camera mount here. The first thing you got to do with a chainsaw before you go to work is to start the thing. So let's start with that. And I haven't run this that much this last few weeks. I'm going to tell you that I'm really beginning to like this saw. Good, easy power, easy to figure out, and that's going to be the discussion, really. You know, you can have a higher performance saw, a narrower power band with the same displacement that can cut faster if you can keep it on the power band, or you can have one like this that's got a very wide power band, and it's really easy to feel it when it's about ready to fall off the power a little bit. And since it doesn't fall off quickly, you can adjust and just keep cutting back off and keep that chain moving. Whereas if you have a peakier power band, what happens is when you get off the power band, if the power drops rapidly, if you were to see it on a chart, you'll stall the chain almost instantly. This one's got a wide power band, good torque for a 70cc saw. Of course, it's 75. And as it's been breaking in, well, you can see it runs good. It's a good running saw. So that's the baseline, right? A 575 that I built, you know, from pretty much spare parts. I'm going to go to the 572 junk pile and just do a couple cuts there. The cookie cut, really what you're going to get from that is sort of a ballpark. Even though I'm using the same bar and chain and all that stuff people theoretically think is the correct way of doing it, what you should be getting out of that is how easy it is for me to adapt to a saw. And do I stall it? Do I keep the chain moving? Is it cutting fast enough? Because I can lay into it and feel it with this saw, where sometimes you can start laying into a saw and it falls off the power band, you start getting that stalling scenario. Or a smaller displacement saw, you get the same thing. And I know that's subtle, but that's really big. And that's why that whole concept of just letting the chain feed its way through with no pressure, really that doesn't show you very much at all, except for how fast that chain is cutting, you know. And if a saw has a little higher RPMs, it's going to cut a little faster. If it has the same, you know, if it can overcome the resistance. You don't really get into a feel for the saw until you start dogging it in. That's when you can start telling if you got, you know, good solid power. And of course you want the RPMs to do things like the bore cutting, you know. But the whole concept of a power band and how that relates to the saw usage is something that really doesn't get talked about much, because it doesn't fit into the narrative of a lot of the saw builders who are looking for peak horsepower. They want to beat somebody at a cookie cut and use that as the definition of win, versus an overall sense of how that saw works with a given operator. New chain, dull chain, hardwood, softwood, whatever, you know, whether it's pure chain speed and a self-feeding chain, or one's a little dull, you got to start dogging it in. Does the power band of that saw make it easy for the operator to adapt to the conditions at hand? And that's what I want to start talking about. And been trying to get my arms around it for a couple of years and really haven't come up with a good way of explaining it. And we'll work on that as this season develops, like getting back into the firewood, and we're going to do some logging this year too. And but anyway, baseline, I think this is a nice saw to run. It really doesn't vibrate much. It's reasonably easy to start. It's really not that heavy. It's heavier than my 565 for sure, but as saws go, if I'm working out in the woods, weight wouldn't be something that comes to mind when I'm working with a saw. I'd be thinking about, wow, this is a wide power band, and I don't have to think as hard, I just have to cut. All I have to do is stick that bar in a tree and cut, and not worry about stalling, not worried about pulling it out, sticking it back in, revved up, you know, if I'm in a bore cut. That's the kind of thing that means something to me. That is compared to just how fast it cut the cookie. Hopefully, that bigger log right there is giving sort of a sense of that. And I can talk about it, but somehow I've got to be able to show it to you. Camera off, we're going to put the bar on the... I'm going to put the bar on the junk pile saw. So let's run the 572 now. Now that's not a totally stock 572. It has a pop-up piston and a thin gasket. But a 572 has some things that should make it run stronger than a 565 anyway. One of the most significant differences is the air filter itself. Also, the transfer port covers are a little different. And there's other things, but fundamentally, those two pieces right there should make a fairly significant difference, you know, in total power output. And so we'll see. Let's just take that one, and it should just basically be the faster of the two saws. And it should be a rival of the 575, if not quicker than that saw as well, even though it doesn't have the same displacement. But it has to get started. Take this bar and put it on the 565. Now I pushed this one until it stalled, kind of to make a point. But this saw here has got good grunt for what it is. It's got a lot more grunt than it did stock. It's not even close. And I love this saw partly because I built it, but also because of its performance. There are some things about it that annoy me, like my mistake on the muffler. But it works, so I'm leaving it right alone. And it's loud. It's really loud. And after a while, I get kind of tired of listening to all that noise. So the 575 doesn't feel significantly less powerful than this saw. Although I know it doesn't make the same kind of cookie cut times. It has good power. It really does. So of the two saws, it's a wash. This one, if I want more speed and a little bit of bling and cool, that 575, you know, it's actually a good saw to work with. It's kind of a toss-up if you were to look at it from a pure performance standpoint. So, but the 575 should be a little heavier. It should be a little slower. It's a lot quieter. It has a very wide power band, but so does this one. This one has one as well. It's about a wash, to be honest with you. A stock 572 is no match for either one of these two saws, either that 575 on the lower end of the power band or this saw. Just this one also has the top end, more so than the 575. But as a work saw, the 575 is nice and smooth, it's quiet, starts, restarts, good wide power band, so I don't have to be quite as finicky. Don't have to have quite as much finesse when I'm really hogging into the wood. It's got enough power and it's a broad enough power band that when I dog into it, it doesn't immediately stall. It gives me a lot of warning because of that wider power band. So I can get it down to lower RPMs and just sort of lay off a little bit, let the chain speed pick up. It's very forgiving that way. That's one of the things I really like about that saw. So let's go to the 565, same bar and chain. Now I'm going to expect it not to be as fast as either one of these two saws. That would be my expectation level based on running it for a couple of years. But what we're going to do is discuss why I still think it's one of my best work saws ever, even over this saw. So change the bar and chain, put that one in the wood. All right, before I get into the cutting, I want to point out a couple of the differences between the 565 and the 572. And externally, there's a couple of things you can see, and both of them affect how much and where the power is delivered on these saws. Number one is the cover for the transfer ports. That's a 565. The 572 simply has more volume. It's a bigger piece. There's more cross-sectional area. And the second is the air box and air filter. That's the 565. The 572 with a bigger air filter. Those two things alone will allow the 572 to make more peak power, right? So why would they do that? Is it a price point thing? Maybe. But what it does do is those two pieces is it tends to pull the power band down in the RPMs. Where that one there with the stuffers and those larger cross-sectional area transfer port covers bring the RPMs up. Should make more peak power by quite a bit. And with my saw, I've also increased the compression, and that'll tend to give it more torque across the power band. Of course, too much compression hurts the high end, but that's a whole different deal. Hurts the top end of the power band, helps the bottom end, mid-range. And of course, I did the muffler mod, which I didn't do correctly, but it actually works pretty good, so I'm leaving it. Now, the other thing between these two saws, which is relevant to me, is the size of the 565 is just simply a smaller package. This one is not only larger, but it has that full wrap handle. This one does not. And if you've been watching any of my videos, when I've been cutting the large maples, as much as I like the full wrap for working waist height and over my head, when I'm on the ground and I'm trying to cut close to the ground, it gets in the way. I lose 4 to 6 inches on every time I use that saw, felling trees. Where the 565, I can just put it virtually flat on the ground. Now there's another big difference in my world. That open muffler, you don't want to drop that saw and have it roll in the mud, A stock muffler is not going to be affected as much if you're out in the snow and the mud and stuff like that. There's things that'll make it a little harder for the debris to get into the motor. Where on my 575, I really do have to think about it. So here's the concept. Here's the thing. I've said it a whole bunch of times. When you make modifications to a saw where you have to work around those modifications, that detracts from the success. So in the case of this one here, while it makes more power with that muffler mod, I now have to consider what happens, if I'm in the snow and the mud, and think about that exit of that muffler to make sure things don't get in there. And that full wrap handle, while it looks cool, and there's places in the saw world where that really makes a lot of sense, I've got to work around it when I'm doing felling on every tree, because it does reduce how close to the ground I can make my my felling cuts. So both those modifications are ones that I have to work around, where the stock saw with a stock muffler, it's a little protected. That dinky little outlet, along with a standard handle, allows me to get close to the ground, and I don't worry so much about debris getting into the muffler. Plus it's quieter. Plus it's a smaller overall feel to the saw. And even though it doesn't weigh much lighter, because it has that smaller package, it feels like it does. It's a perception versus a reality thing. So again, if you look at it from that alone, power being equal, the 565, because it's just easier to deal with, would win that comparison in terms of which one's a better work saw. Now, fun. That one wins it hands down. Number one, I built it. Number two, as long as I'm not running it for hours on end, I don't mind the noise. It's kind of cool. It sounds cool. And I like the way it looks. So that trumps practical. But anyway, I'm getting off in the weeds. Let's see how really bad that 565 runs as compared to a bigger saw that actually has a little bit of a compression increase, and a mildly modded saw that's supposed to run better stock. And then with those two modifications I made to that saw, should run quite a bit better. There's another little detail. Since I have the stock side cover, it has the captured bar nuts, so it's a little easier to deal with there. You're not going to lose those in the snow or the mud. And when I put the OEM full wrap on the 572, I had to go back to a 372 style cover that doesn't have those captured nuts. Now I'm going to modify one of these, drill some holes, so that I can have this style cover back on the 572. I mean, this is what it came with stock, one of these. But when I put the full wrap kit on there, it went to that style, which belongs on a saw like that one. So anyway, another small detail, and again it falls into the category of life with a saw. Not having the full wrap getting in the way of the bar nuts and things, although it does allow me fairly good access. I can use a wrench on that saw, but it does make it a lot easier to get the bar and chain on and off the 565, plus with this cover with the captured nuts, you know. Again, it's those little things that begin to keep pulling the chips to the side of the 565. What happens with me is those life with a saw type things add up. And at the end of the day, if a particular saw has enough of those things, it makes it easier to live with that saw day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out, and it makes enough power, it wins, versus a saw that I have to work around things all the time. You know, that 575 is a little bit of a surprise, but this one right here, I love it. I love the way it runs. I said it before, but just changing the bar like I just finished doing, you know, I begin to remember why I like that saw. You know, thinking about the muffler and the stuff that falls in there when it rolls off the tractor, thinking about the extra weight that I got to carry around, thinking about how low I can cut because I have to work around the full wrap handle. Those things begin to add up. And then those things like the smaller transfer caps, stuffers, air box begin to fade to the background, assuming they reduce the performance some, but not so much that it's a problem. And that's really the key here. So let's find out how really slow the 565 is relative to a mildly hopped up 572 and a fairly stock 575 with 5 cc's more displacement and a little more compression. And while I'm at it, let me just talk about this one for a second. This is a stock 572 XPG, and the difference between a 572 XPG and the standard 572 is the heated handle. You'll see a wire up there, and there's a switch right there, and it carries a generator underneath the flywheel, and all that adds up to about a ½ pound. But I want you to look at this. The stock muffler is pretty much the same as the 565. So some of the complaints that I have relative to my hot rod right there don't apply to a stock 572 like this one right here. You know, this one doesn't have a muffler that's open, you know, it doesn't have a full wrap, and the stock 572 does come with a cover with the captured nuts. So really, if you compare that saw to a stock one of those, it's a slightly different comparison. And it would boil down to the difference in the power bands because of the stuffers, transfer port caps, and air box, really, when it gets right down to it. But I'm not going to run this today. I've never fired this up. Bought it brand new, and I still have its box. It'll eventually get run, but it'll be when Bob and I decide to go and run some saws that are in that same kind of condition. It'll be cherry popping get together, I guess. So anyway, so we did that saw. That's a 575, 572 slightly modified, and now I have my 565 absolutely stock, no changes whatsoever in any way, shape, or form. So let's see how really poorly it performs as compared to a bigger saw with a little bit more compression in the same basic cylinder and saw with a larger airbox, modded muffler, pop-up piston, and some other changes. You know, thin gasket, and I did massage the transfers a little bit, but also it's got the full wrap and the old style cover, all that kind of stuff. Plain Jane 565. First you got to get it started. Now remember, that one hasn't been run probably in a year. So there it is, bone stock. Now I can feel the difference. Both the 575 and 572 have quite a bit more oomph than this saw, and it'll show in the times. And so if you were to go strictly by cookie cut times, either one of those two saws is probably a better pick than the 565. And probably notice this is not quite as sharp on the throttle response as the 572 hot rod saw. It's not going to be as sharp as a 572 stock either. The 572 stock is going to have more horsepower with a little bit higher chain speed, upper RPMs, so it'll win any cookie cut race over a 565. But when you get down into that tug and chug long bar in the wood, the 565 will hold its own against the 572. It'll stick right with it. Finesse, the 572 should win even in that scenario, but this one is just very easy to adapt to because it gives you all kinds of warning before it gets out of power. So you can finesse back up, let it pick up speed, lay back into the wood. It's very easy to find that maximum chain speed relative to the saw RPM on a saw like this. Same as the 575, by the way. It's just the 575 has more displacement. So my analysis to this point in time, before I see the actual times, is these three saws, the 575, the 572 hot rod, both of those saws will win a cookie cut race over this saw any day of the week, all day long, and have more power. They both have more power. They both have more throttle response, although the 575 is not that much snappier than this one right here. This one here and the 575 are in the same class in terms of throttle response. But my 572 hot rod, a lot better throttle response. And the stock will be better as well. This one has good power, solid power, easy to deal with power. And when you're working that, sometimes it's just as important as peak power. It feels lighter, it doesn't vibrate much, and I can tell you it doesn't use as much fuel as my 572. And with the standard handle, for me felon, this actually is a better saw because I don't have to work around the geometry of the bigger handle. I don't have to worry about the muffler mod. And even though it's not as fast, I found over the years that this is just a very, very pleasant saw to go to work with. So it depends on what your definition of win is. For me, the definition of win is a saw that I can work with all day long and not get tired. Whether it's noise pressure, weight, vibration, fighting around an issue like a lack of power or something like that, this one makes enough power. It's lighter than the other two saws. It uses less fuel. It's quieter. It doesn't vibrate as much. And the geometry of the components of the saw are more conducive to the work that I do. So it's going to lose the cookie cut race, as we'll find out when I get back to the editor, but it's still a better work saw for me. Not for you guys, for me. But I got to tell you that 575 is, damn, that thing is getting right in there, because it has a lot of the same qualities that this saw does. It's a little bit heavier, but it's just as smooth, but it has more. It just has more power.